In December of 1849, in the city of St. Petersburg, a group of young men were led out into a frozen courtyard to be shot. They had already said goodbye to one another. They had already made their peace, such peace as men can make when they are 28 years old and about to die for something they wrote, something they believed, something they whispered in a room they thought was private. The soldiers were in position, the rifles were loaded, the first 3 prisoners had been tied to posts, blindfolded, their shirts torn open despite the cold so the bullets would find flesh and not fabric. One of those men was Fyodor Dostoevsky. He stood in the second row, which meant he had perhaps 90 seconds left to live. Just enough time to watch his friends die first. Just enough time to feel the winter air against his skin, to hear the officer begin to give the order, to understand with perfect and absolute clarity that this was the end of everything he would ever think or feel or write. And then, nothing happened. Or rather, something happened that was worse than the bullet, in a way he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. A messenger arrived. A drum rolled. The execution was halted at the last possible moment. The Tsar, in his infinite mercy, had commuted the sentence. It had all been staged. Every detail. The courtyard, the soldiers, the loaded rifles, the torn shirts, the 90 seconds of absolute terror. All of it a performance designed to break these men psychologically before sending them to prison in Siberia. The Tsar wanted them to feel death. He wanted them to carry it inside them forever, and Dostoevsky did. He carried it for the next 32 years, through labour camps and epileptic seizures, and gambling debts, and the deaths of children and marriages that fractured under the weight of his obsessions. He carried it into every novel he wrote, which is to say, he carried it into some of the most disturbing, most beautiful, most psychologically relentless literature ever produced by a human mind. That moment in the courtyard, those 90 seconds, became the seed of everything. But here is what the comfortable version of the story does not tell you. The comfortable version says Dostoevsky was a great writer who suffered and then triumphed. It says he descended into darkness and emerged with wisdom. It says the mock execution was a turning point, a crucible, a thing that made him stronger. And there is truth in that, as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. Because the terrifying truth about Fyodor Dostoevsky is not that he survived suffering. It is that he understood something about the human mind, about your mind, about what lives in the basement of every person's consciousness, that most of us spend our entire lives trying not to see. He went down into the dark, and he came back, and he told us what he found there. And what he found there is still true. It is true right now, as you lie there in the dark yourself listening to this. He found that human beings are not rational, that we do not want what we say we want, that we will destroy ourselves, knowingly and deliberately, simply to prove that we can, that the capacity for cruelty is not a flaw in our nature but a feature of it, that the most dangerous place in the universe is not some distant galaxy, but the inside of a person's head. And he found something else, something even more unsettling. He found that this darkness, this capacity for destruction, is not separate from the light, that the same mind that contains the impulse toward evil also contains the impulse toward love, toward sacrifice, toward a beauty so overwhelming it can break a person open. And these things do not cancel each other out. They coexist. They feed on each other. They are, in some way we cannot fully articulate, the same thing. This is why reading Dostoevsky feels different from reading other writers. This is why people who encounter his novels often describe the experience in the language of crisis, of transformation, of being fundamentally altered by words on a page. He is not showing you a story. He's showing you yourself, and what he shows you is not comfortable. So let us go slowly. Let us go back to the beginning, long before the courtyard, long before the rifles, to a time when Fyodor Dostoevsky was just a boy in Moscow, in a hospital for the poor, where his father worked as a doctor, and where death was an ordinary daily presence, as familiar as breakfast. The hospital was called the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, and it was exactly what the name suggested, a place where people who had nothing came to suffer and often to die, attended by doctors who were themselves only a few steps above poverty. The building sat on the outskirts of Moscow, and the Dostoevsky family lived in a small apartment within its walls, which meant that Fyodor's earliest memories were saturated with the smells of sickness, the sounds of pain, and the particular quality of silence that descends when someone has stopped breathing. His father, Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, was a complicated man, which is a polite way of saying he was difficult, demanding, and possibly cruel. He had clawed his way up from nothing. The son of a village priest, he had somehow obtained a medical education and a position that granted him minor noble status. But the effort of that climb had twisted something in him. He was rigid with his children. He was suspicious of joy. He drank, and when he drank, his suspicions curdled into something darker. Fyodor's mother, Maria Fyodorovna, was different. She was warm where her husband was cold, gentle where he was harsh, and she died when Fyodor was 15 years old, which is to say she died at exactly the moment when a boy most needs someone to remind him that tenderness exists in the world. Her death from tuberculosis left the children in the sole care of their father, whose drinking increased, and whose suspicions deepened into something that the servants would later describe with careful, frightened words. There were 8 children in the family. Fyodor was the second son, which meant he existed in that particular psychological space of being neither the heir nor the baby, required to compete for attention without the advantages of either position. His older brother Mikhail would become his closest friend, his collaborator, his confidant through decades of crisis. But in childhood, the boys were simply 2 among many, trying to survive a household that was simultaneously respectable and terrifying. What did young Fyodor see in those early years? He saw patients arriving at the hospital on carts, sometimes alone, sometimes in bundles of bodies that had to be sorted into the living and the dead. He saw his father treating them with competence but without warmth, as if sickness were an insult to his dignity. He saw his mother growing thinner, coughing more, retreating into the bedroom from which she would eventually not emerge. He saw the Moscow streets in winter, the beggars huddled against walls, the vast distance between the people who had money and the people who had none. And he read. This is the part of the story that matters most, because what Fyodor Dostoevsky became was shaped not only by what he suffered, but by what he consumed. His parents, for all their flaws, believed in education. They hired tutors, they filled the apartment with books, and Fyodor devoured them with a hunger that frightened and pleased the adults around him. He read Pushkin before he was 10 years old. He read Gogol's grotesque comedies of Russian life. He read the great European novelists Walter Scott, Anne Radcliffe, Honoré de Balzac, who showed him that fiction could contain entire worlds, that a story could be as real as the hospital corridors he walked every day. He read Schiller's dramas of idealism and tragedy, and he wept. He wept openly, dramatically, in the way that boys are supposed to be embarrassed by, but that Fyodor never was. His brother Mikhail remembered those tears. He remembered the 2 of them reading Schiller together, both of them overwhelmed, both of them feeling something that the cramped apartment and the sick patients and their father's suspicious eyes could not contain. Literature was escape, yes, but it was also something more. It was proof that the inner life, the world of thought and feeling and imagination, was real, that it mattered, that a person could build something in words that would outlast everything that tried to destroy them. This was the first article of Dostoevsky's faith, established before he was 15, that the human spirit was infinite, that it could not be crushed, that somewhere inside every person was a flame that no external force could extinguish. He would spend the rest of his life testing that belief, putting it under pressures that would have destroyed most people, watching it flicker and dim but never quite go out. And his novels are the record of that test, not triumphant declarations of the spirit's victory, but honest, unflinching accounts of what happens when the spirit is pushed to the very edge of extinction and has to decide whether to keep burning or let the darkness in. When his mother died, the world changed. His father, unmoored by grief and possibly by something darker in his own nature, sent Fyodor and Mikhail to St. Petersburg to attend a military engineering academy. It was a practical decision. Engineers had stable careers, and the family could not afford to support literary ambitions. But it was also perhaps a way of getting the older boys out of the house, before they saw too clearly what their father was becoming. The Academy of Military Engineering was everything Fyodor hated. It was regimented. It was focused on mathematics and practical skills rather than literature and philosophy. It was full of young men who cared about advancement and rank, and the precise way to tie a uniform, when all Fyodor wanted was to read novels and argue about the nature of the soul. He was not a good student. He was not a good soldier in training. He was awkward and intense and prone to outbursts that his classmates found alternately fascinating and alarming. But he survived. He learned to draw, which engineers were required to do, and he discovered he had some talent for it. He learned mathematics, which he detested. He learned to navigate an institution that did not care about his inner life at all, which was perhaps the most valuable lesson: how to protect the flame when no one around you believes it exists. And he kept reading. He read Balzac obsessively, amazed at the Frenchman's ability to capture the textures of social life, the machinery of ambition and money and desire. He read Gogol's Dead Souls, and understood for the first time what Russian literature could be. Not an imitation of European models, but something new, something that spoke in the language of Russian absurdity and Russian suffering. He read the German Romantics and the French Romantics and the English Romantics, and he felt that he was part of something larger than himself, a great conversation about what it meant to be human that had been going on for centuries and would continue long after he was dead. Then, when Fyodor was 17 years old, word arrived from the country estate where his father had retired. Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky was dead. The official report said he had died of a stroke. But the servants told a different story. They said that the peasants on the estate, pushed beyond endurance by the doctor's cruelty and drunken rages, had risen up and killed him. They said it had been brutal. They said the body showed signs of violence that a stroke could not explain. No one was ever prosecuted. No investigation was conducted. The death was quietly recorded and quietly forgotten, except by the sons who had to live with it. What does it do to a young man to learn that his father has been murdered by people he was oppressing? What does it do to carry inside you the knowledge that your parent was hated enough to be killed, and that the hatred was deserved? Some biographers doubt the murder story. They point out that the evidence is thin, that the servants' accounts were second-hand, that people in 19th century Russia often embellished tales of violence. But Dostoevsky himself seems to have believed it, or at least to have been haunted by the possibility. The theme of patricide, of sons who desire their fathers' deaths, of guilt that cannot be expiated, runs through his work like a dark river, surfacing most terrifyingly in The Brothers Karamazov, his final and greatest novel, where a father is murdered and every son carries a portion of the guilt. We do not need to know for certain what happened to Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky. What matters is what his son made of it. What matters is that Fyodor emerged from childhood with a particular knowledge that most people are protected from. The knowledge that violence lives close to the surface of ordinary life, that the structures we build to contain human cruelty are fragile, that any of us might, under the right conditions, become either the victim or the perpetrator. This knowledge is the first chamber of the house that Dostoevsky would build in his novels. You enter through suffering. You enter through the understanding that no one is safe. He finished his engineering training in 1843 and immediately did everything he could to avoid working as an engineer. He took a position in the drafting department of the engineering corps, which was tedious but left him time to write. He spent his money, what little he had, on books and on a lifestyle he could not afford: dinners, theatre tickets, the accoutrements of a literary man rather than a military draftsman. He was broke almost immediately. He would be broke, with brief interruptions for most of his life. And he wrote. He wrote in the evenings after the drafting work was done. He wrote in rented rooms by candlelight, filling pages with a story that had been forming in his mind since childhood. It was the story of a poor clerk, a man so insignificant that the world seemed designed to crush him, who falls in love with a young woman he can never have. It was the story of what poverty does to the soul, what loneliness does, what the relentless indifference of a great city does to the people who live in its shadows. He called it Poor Folk, and when he finished it, he gave it to a friend named Dmitry Grigorovich, who was also trying to become a writer, who read it and was so stunned that he brought it to Nikolai Nekrasov, a poet and editor who was then one of the most influential literary figures in Russia. Nekrasov and Grigorovich read the manuscript together, late into the night. When they finished at 4 o'clock in the morning, they went immediately to Dostoevsky's apartment and woke him up to tell him that he had written something extraordinary. Then Nekrasov brought the manuscript to Vissarion Belinsky. This name requires some explanation, because Belinsky is largely forgotten now, but in the Russia of the 1840s, he was the most powerful critic in the country. The man whose approval could make a writer's career, and whose disapproval could end it. He was intense, brilliant, tubercular, and uncompromising. He believed that literature had a purpose beyond entertainment. It was supposed to reveal truth, to expose injustice, to awaken the conscience of a sleeping society. He was looking for a writer who could do for Russia what Dickens was doing for England. Show the world the suffering of the poor, the forgotten, the invisible. Nekrasov handed him Poor Folk and told him to read it. Belinsky read it. And then he said, according to the accounts that have survived, a new Gogol has appeared. When Dostoevsky was brought to meet him, Belinsky reportedly grabbed the young man by the shoulders and looked at him with something like awe. "Do you realize what you have written?" he demanded. "You have touched the most terrible depths of life." Fyodor Dostoevsky was 24 years old. He had spent his childhood in a hospital for the poor, lost his mother to consumption, possibly lost his father to murder, endured years of military training he despised, and written in obscurity while working a job he hated. And now, the most important critic in Russia was telling him that he was a genius, that he had done something no one else could do, that his suffering had been worth something after all. What does that moment do to a person? It does complicated things. It does dangerous things. The publication of Poor Folk in 1846 made Dostoevsky famous. He was suddenly invited everywhere, to salons, to dinner parties, to the gatherings of St. Petersburg's literary elite. Belinsky introduced him to other writers, to intellectuals, to people who mattered. For a brief intoxicating period, he was the most talked about young author in the capital, and he handled it badly. This is not the official version of the story, the version that wants Dostoevsky to be a saint of suffering. But it is the true version, and Dostoevsky himself would have insisted on the truth. Fame went to his head. He became arrogant. He became insufferable. He talked too much at parties, insisted on being the centre of attention, behaved as if his genius gave him permission to treat other people as an audience rather than as equals. The same sensitivity that allowed him to feel his way into the consciousness of a poor clerk also made him thin-skinned, easily wounded, quick to perceive slights where none were intended. His second novel, The Double, was a psychological study of a man who encounters his own doppelganger and gradually loses his grip on reality. Dostoevsky thought it was brilliant. Belinsky was less impressed. The critics were mixed. The public, which had loved the emotional directness of Poor Folk, did not know what to make of this strange, disorienting narrative about madness and identity. Dostoevsky responded to criticism the way he would always respond to criticism, with a mixture of defiance and devastation. He insisted that The Double was misunderstood, that the world was not ready for what he was trying to do. He also, privately, collapsed. He had staked everything on this second book, and it had not delivered the triumph he expected. The next few years were difficult. He wrote more, but nothing captured the public the way Poor Folk had. He fell in with a group of young intellectuals who met secretly to discuss forbidden ideas, socialism, revolution, the abolition of serfdom. These were dangerous topics in the Russia of Tsar Nicholas III, who ruled with an iron fist and saw any hint of liberal thought as a threat to the social order. Dostoevsky was not a revolutionary. He was not even, at this point, particularly political, but he was drawn to the excitement, to the feeling of being part of something important, to the late-night discussions where young men with fire in their eyes talked about changing the world. He attended the meetings of the Petrashevsky Circle, a group named after its host, Mikhail Petrashevsky, who had gathered around him a collection of dissatisfied intellectuals, Fourierists, socialists, and general troublemakers. They talked, they argued, they read forbidden books, they dreamed of a Russia where the serfs would be free and the Tsar's absolute power would be checked by something resembling law. And the Tsar's secret police listened. In April of 1849, the arrests began. Dostoevsky was taken from his apartment in the middle of the night, as political prisoners are always taken, without warning, without explanation, without any chance to prepare. He was brought to the Peter and Paul Fortress, the most feared prison in Russia, a place where political enemies disappeared and were sometimes never seen again. For 8 months he sat in a cell, not knowing what would happen to him. He was interrogated. He was questioned about the meetings, about the forbidden books, about his associations with known radicals. He told the truth mostly because the alternative was worse. The interrogators already knew almost everything. The irony was that Dostoevsky had not actually done anything. He had attended meetings. He had listened to discussions. He had read aloud once a banned letter by Belinsky that criticised the Orthodox Church and the Russian government. But he had not plotted revolution. He had not built bombs. He had not done anything that, in a rational legal system, would warrant imprisonment. But this was not a rational legal system. This was Tsar Nicholas III, who believed that the slightest tolerance of liberal ideas would lead to the kind of revolution that had convulsed Europe in 1848. He wanted to make an example. In December, Dostoevsky and the other prisoners were brought before a military tribunal and sentenced to death by firing squad. And then, on the morning of December 22nd, 1849, they were taken to Semyonov Square to be executed. This is where we began, with the courtyard, the rifles, the 90 seconds of absolute terror. But now we can see it differently. Now we can see the young man standing there in the second row. Not a genius, not a saint, just a frightened human being who had made some foolish choices and was about to pay for them with his life. He was 28 years old. He had published a few books, one of which had been praised and the others of which had been largely forgotten. He had made enemies among the critics. He had made enemies among other writers. He had behaved badly at parties and borrowed money he could not repay, and fallen in love with women who did not love him back. And now he was going to die. The first 3 prisoners were tied to posts. Dostoevsky watched from the second row, close enough to see everything, close enough to see the officers checking the rifles, close enough to see the blindfolds being placed over his friend's eyes. Later, he would describe this moment in his novel The Idiot, where Prince Mishkin tells a group of listeners about a man who faced execution and was reprieved at the last moment. The description is so precise, so psychologically detailed, that it can only have come from direct experience. He said that those 5 minutes seemed to him an infinite time, a vast wealth. He felt that he had so many lives left in those 5 minutes that there was no need yet to think of the last moment, so much so that he divided his time up. He set aside time to take leave of his comrades, 2 minutes for that, then he set aside another 2 minutes to think for the last time, and then a minute to look about him for the last time. 90 seconds. That is what Dostoevsky had. The first 3 men would be shot, and then it would be his turn, and then it would be over. What do you think about in 90 seconds, when you know that everything after those 90 seconds is going to be nothing? Dostoevsky thought about light. He would write about it later, how the sun hit the golden dome of a church in the distance, how that light seemed to contain everything he had ever felt or wanted, how he thought that if he could just merge with that light, become part of it somehow, then perhaps death would not be the end after all. He thought about time, about how these 90 seconds contained more life than all the years he had wasted, all the books he had meant to write and had not written, all the people he had meant to love and had not loved. The concentration of consciousness into those final moments was so intense that it seemed to stretch infinity into a space the size of a heartbeat. He thought about what he would do if somehow, impossibly, he survived, if someone gave him his life back, if he could start over. And then the messenger arrived, and then the drum rolled, and then the officer announced that the Tsar, in his infinite mercy, had commuted the sentences, exile to Siberia instead of death, hard labour instead of the bullet. The first 3 men were untied from their posts. The blindfolds were removed. One of them, a man named Nikolai Grigoriev, had gone mad. He never recovered. The shock of the reprieve after the certainty of death had broken something in his mind that could not be repaired. Dostoevsky did not go mad, but he was changed. Something had cracked open in those 90 seconds, some chamber of his consciousness that had been locked before. He had seen death. He had felt it. He had watched it come for him and then, at the last moment, pull back. And what he saw in that moment, what he understood about time, about consciousness, about the unbearable preciousness of being alive, would become the foundation of everything he wrote afterward. The comfortable version of this story says that the mock execution made Dostoevsky a better writer, that suffering was good for him, that he needed to be broken in order to create. But this is not quite true, and Dostoevsky himself would have rejected it. What the mock execution did was not make him better. It made him different. It made him someone who had died and come back, someone who knew, not intellectually but in his body and his nerves, that every moment of life was borrowed, that death was always standing at your shoulder, that the only thing that mattered was what you did with the time you'd been given, and it made him someone who could not look away from the darkness. Because he had been in the darkness. He had been inside those 90 seconds. and he had seen what was there. And he knew now that the darkness was not something external, something that happened to you from outside. The darkness was inside. It was always inside. It was part of what it meant to be human. This is the knowledge he brought out of that courtyard. This is what he would spend the next 32 years trying to articulate in novels that would disturb and transform and illuminate millions of readers. This is the terrifying truth that he discovered, there in the snow, waiting to be shot, that we are not who we pretend to be, that beneath the surface of every civilized person is something wild and hungry and capable of anything, and that the only way to live honestly is to acknowledge this, to look at it directly, and to find, if you can, some reason to keep going anyway. They put him in chains and sent him to Siberia. The journey took weeks. It was winter, and the prisoners travelled in open carts through temperatures that dropped below what most human beings can survive. Dostoevsky's wrists were locked in iron shackles. His ankles were chained. He wore the clothes he had been arrested in, supplemented by whatever scraps the convoy guards threw his way. Somewhere along the route, in the town of Tobolsk, the convoy stopped. And there, in that frozen outpost, something happened that Dostoevsky would remember for the rest of his life. A group of wives, women who had followed their husbands into exile decades earlier, after an earlier failed rebellion, came to meet the new prisoners. They brought food, they brought warm clothing, and they brought something else, copies of the New Testament, the only book that prisoners were allowed to have in the labour camps. One of these women pressed a copy into Dostoevsky's hands. It was small, worn, with pages softened by years of use. Inside, someone had hidden a 10-ruble note, a fortune for a man in chains. He would keep that book for the rest of his life. He would read it in the labour camp, in the barracks, in the hospitals, in the desperate years that followed. It would become the foundation of a faith that was not simple, not easy, not the faith of a person who had never doubted. It was the faith of someone who had looked into the void and decided against all evidence that there was something on the other side. This is the other half of the terrifying truth about Dostoevsky, the half that makes it bearable. He saw the darkness. He went into it. He understood what human beings are capable of, the cruelty and the madness and the self-destruction. But he also believed, with a conviction that had been tested in the fire of that courtyard and the ice of that Siberian convoy, that love was real, that redemption was possible, that even the most broken person could be transformed. He believed this because he had to, because the alternative was to become like Nikolai Grigoriev, untied from the execution post with his mind already gone, staring at a world that no longer made sense. Dostoevsky chose to believe. And his novels are the record of that choice. Not a triumphant declaration of faith, but an ongoing struggle, a constant negotiation between the darkness and the light, conducted in full view of the reader, with nothing hidden, nothing sanitized, nothing made easier than it actually is. This is why people still read him. This is why his books, written in 19th century Russia about characters and situations that no longer exist, continue to feel urgent, necessary, almost unbearably alive. He is not giving you answers. He is showing you the questions. He is showing you the inside of a human mind trying to figure out how to live in a world where death is certain, meaning is uncertain, and the darkness inside us is always waiting. And he is doing this with a compassion, a tenderness, a profound love for the struggling human creature that makes the darkness bearable, that transforms terror into something closer to understanding. So lie there in the dark and let his voice come to you across a century and a half. He has something to tell you about yourself, and he has all the time in the world to tell it. The labour camp was called Omsk, and it was located in a part of Siberia so remote, so cold, so forgotten by the rest of the world that even the guards considered their postings a form of punishment. Dostoevsky arrived there in January of 1850, still wearing his chains, still carrying the New Testament that the women of Tobolsk had given him. For the next 4 years this would be his world. The prison compound was surrounded by a wooden palisade, beyond which stretched the endless Siberian steppe, flat, white, featureless, disappearing into a horizon that seemed to mock the very idea of escape. The prisoners slept in large barracks, hundreds of men crowded into spaces designed for a fraction of that number. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of sickness, of despair. In winter, the temperature inside the barracks dropped below freezing. In summer, it became a furnace of disease and sweat. Dostoevsky worked. He carried bricks. He shoveled snow. He turned a great wheel that powered some piece of machinery whose purpose he never understood. He did whatever the guards told him to do because the punishment for refusal was flogging, and he had seen what flogging did to a man. The way the skin opened, the way the screams went on longer than seemed possible, the way some men never recovered. He was not allowed to write. This was the cruelest part of the punishment for someone whose entire existence was bound up in words. For 4 years he could not put pen to paper. He could only think. He could only observe. He could only store up everything he was seeing and feeling and understanding, waiting for the day when he would be allowed to release it. And what he saw in that prison was humanity stripped of all pretense. He saw men who had murdered their families and men who had stolen bread because they were starving. He saw aristocrats reduced to the same filth and suffering as peasants. He saw cruelty that made him weep, and kindness that made him weep harder. He saw what happens to human beings when all the structures of civilization are removed, when there is nothing left but the bare fact of existence. And he began to understand something that would become the foundation of his mature work. The peasants, the common people of Russia, the serfs and labourers whom the intellectuals in St. Petersburg debated about but rarely encountered, were not abstractions. They were not noble savages waiting to be enlightened by Western ideas. They were not political symbols. They were human beings, as complicated and contradictory and capable of grace as anyone else. And they knew things that the intellectuals did not know. They had a relationship with suffering, with faith, with the basic questions of existence that the educated classes had lost. Dostoevsky entered the prison as a liberal, a westernizer, a man who believed that Russia's salvation lay in adopting European ideas and institutions. He emerged as something different. He emerged as someone who believed that the Russian soul, whatever that meant, and he would spend decades trying to articulate it, contained a wisdom that Europe had forgotten, a capacity for suffering and forgiveness, a connection to Christ that went deeper than theology. This was the beginning of his conservatism, his nationalism, his complicated and sometimes troubling politics. It was also the beginning of his deepest compassion, a compassion that extended not only to the victims of injustice, but to the perpetrators, not only to the good, but to the broken, the cruel, the lost. Because in that prison, he had seen that everyone was broken, everyone was cruel, everyone was lost, and if redemption was possible for him, for the arrogant young writer who had handled fame badly and wandered into revolutionary circles for the excitement, then it was possible for anyone. The 4 years passed. They passed slowly, as years in prison always do, but they passed. And then Dostoevsky was released, not into freedom, but into mandatory military service, which was the second part of his sentence. He was sent to a garrison in another remote corner of the empire, where he spent 6 more years as a soldier, first as a private, and then, gradually, as an officer. The conditions were better than prison, but not by much. He was still in Siberia. He was still far from everything and everyone he loved. He was still forbidden to publish, still forbidden to return to St. Petersburg, still watched by authorities who suspected that a man who had once been arrested for radical ideas could not be truly reformed. But he could write again, and he wrote. He wrote in secret at first, hiding his manuscripts, waiting for the day when he would be allowed to send them into the world. He worked on a novel called The House of the Dead, which would tell the story of his prison years in barely fictionalized form, a book that would shock Russian readers with its honesty about what happened inside the camps, what was done to men in the name of justice, and he wrote letters, hundreds of letters to his brother Mikhail, to friends, to anyone who would maintain contact with a man who had disappeared into the frozen edge of the empire. In those letters, he poured out everything he was thinking, everything he was feeling, everything he had learned in the crucible of those 4 years. One passage from one of those letters has become famous because it captures something essential about who Dostoevsky had become. I will tell you that I am a child of this century, a child of disbelief and doubt. It has cost me and will cost me so much suffering, this thirst for faith which is so much stronger in my soul because of the arguments against it. And yet, God sometimes sends me moments in which I am wholly at peace. And in those moments I have constructed for myself a credo in which everything is clear and sacred to me. This credo is very simple, to believe that there is nothing more beautiful, more profound, more sympathetic, more reasonable, more courageous and more perfect than Christ. And not only is there nothing, but I tell myself with jealous love that there cannot be anything. This is the faith of Dostoevsky, not a faith that has never doubted, but a faith that has passed through doubt and come out the other side. Not a comfortable certainty, but a desperate love, held onto in the face of everything that argues against it. And this is what he would spend the rest of his life writing about. The struggle to believe. The agony of the person who cannot accept easy answers but cannot live without some answer. The tension between the mind that sees all the arguments against meaning and the heart that refuses to accept meaninglessness. His characters would argue about God with a passion and intensity that makes most theological discussions seem pale and academic. They would murder and repent, doubt and believe, descend into the deepest darkness and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, find their way back to something that looked like light. And the reader, following along, would find that the struggle was their own, that Dostoevsky was not telling them what to believe, but showing them what it felt like to try to believe, to need to believe, in a world that made believing almost impossible. In 1859, a decade after the mock execution, Fyodor Dostoevsky was finally allowed to return to European Russia. He was 37 years old. He had spent 8 of the last 10 years in prison and military service. He had married badly to a woman named Maria Dmitrievna, whom he had met in Siberia, and who was already dying of tuberculosis when he proposed. He had written, but he had published almost nothing. The literary world had largely forgotten him. Everything was going to have to be rebuilt from the beginning. But he had something now that he had not had as a young man. He had the prison years. He had the New Testament that he had read over and over in the barracks. He had the faces of the murderers and the thieves, the flogged backs and the frozen hands, the moments of unexpected grace in the midst of unbearable suffering. He had become, in other words, the writer who would create crime and punishment, the idiot, demons, and the brothers Karamazov. The young man who had entered that courtyard in 1849 waiting to be shot would not have been capable of those books. He was too arrogant, too untested, too convinced that his suffering was unique rather than universal. But the man who emerged from Siberia was different. The man who emerged had been cracked open, had seen what he was capable of and what others were capable of, had learned that the darkness was not somewhere else, in criminals and madmen, but here, inside, in everyone. And he had learned something else, something that the mock execution had shown him in those 90 seconds of absolute terror, that every moment of life was precious, that time was not infinite but desperately, achingly finite, that whatever he was going to do, he had to do it now because the messenger might not arrive next time, the drum might not roll, the reprieve might not come. He had been given his life back. He had been given a second chance, and he was not going to waste it. The next 30 years would be the most productive, the most turbulent, the most transformative period in his life. He would write the novels that would change literature forever. He would marry again, more happily. He would lose children to death, and nearly lose his mind to grief. He would gamble away fortunes and beg creditors for extensions. He would argue with other writers, with critics, with the political movements of his age. And at the end of it, he would leave behind a body of work that still speaks to us today, still disturbs us, still challenges us, still shows us things about ourselves that we might prefer not to see. But all of that is still to come, for now he is on a train heading west, toward St. Petersburg, toward the literary world that had forgotten him, toward the life he had almost lost in that courtyard 10 years ago. The sun is setting over the Russian steppe, the same sun that had struck the golden dome of the church on the morning he thought he was going to die. And somewhere in his bag is the New Testament from Tobolsk, its pages soft from years of handling, its words memorized by now, its promise of redemption held close against the long night ahead. He does not know what is coming. He cannot know, but he is ready. And we have all the time in the world to follow him there. The St. Petersburg that greeted Fyodor Dostoevsky in 1859 was not the city he had left. A decade had passed, and in that time Russia itself had begun to shift beneath its own weight, like ice cracking slowly on a great river in the first uncertain warmth of spring. The old Tsar, Nicholas I, was dead. The same Tsar who had signed the death warrant and then the reprieve, who had orchestrated the theatrical cruelty of the mock execution. He had died during the Crimean War, that disastrous conflict that had exposed the rottenness at the heart of the empire, the backwardness of its army, the brittleness of its institutions. His son, Alexander II, sat on the throne now, and Alexander was speaking of reforms. He was speaking of freeing the serfs. For a man who had spent a decade in Siberia, much of it among peasants and common criminals, this was no abstract political question. Dostoevsky had lived among the people who would be freed. He had worked beside them, eaten with them, been beaten alongside them. He knew their faces, their hands, their silences. He knew the particular quality of their faith, that strange mixture of fatalism and hope that had both baffled and moved him in the prison barracks. And he knew something else, something that would set him apart from most of the reformers and radicals who now filled the salons of the capital. He knew that freedom alone would not save them, that the chains they wore were not only made of iron, but these were thoughts he would develop later, in the great novel still to come. For now, in the winter of 1859, he was a man without a position, without money, without a clear path forward. His literary reputation, such as it had been, had faded almost to nothing. The critics who had once celebrated him had moved on to new favourites. The magazines that had once published him had new editors with new tastes. He was, in many ways, starting over, a 37-year-old man with a sick wife, no steady income, and a decade of silence to explain. And yet he was not discouraged. Or rather, his discouragement was of a particular kind, shot through with a restless, almost feverish energy that would characterize the rest of his life. He had work to do. He had things to say. The years in Siberia had filled him with material that pressed against the inside of his skull like water against a dam, demanding release. He had watched men. He had studied them with the intensity of someone who knew that understanding them was a matter of survival. And what he had learned, what he had seen, was nothing less than the full range of human possibility. The capacity for cruelty, yes, but also the capacity for sudden, inexplicable tenderness. The way a murderer could weep over a dead bird, the way a thief could share his last crust of bread with a stranger, the contradictions that made up a human soul. This was what he brought back from Siberia. Not optimism exactly, not faith in progress or human perfectibility. Something stranger and more valuable, a deep unsentimental knowledge of what human beings actually were, beneath the masks they wore for society, beneath the stories they told themselves about their own goodness. He had seen the beast, and he had seen the saint, and he had learned that they often lived in the same body, sometimes in the same moment. The first work to emerge from this knowledge was Notes from the House of the Dead, a fictionalized account of his prison years that he began publishing in 1860. It was unlike anything Russian literature had produced before. Other writers had written about prisons, about punishment, about the lower depths of society. But Dostoevsky had actually been there. He had not observed from a safe distance or imagined from the comfort of a study. He had lived it, in his body, for 4 years, and the difference was palpable on every page. The book is structured as a memoir, supposedly written by a fictional nobleman who has been sent to prison for murdering his wife. But the narrator quickly fades into the background, becoming little more than a pair of eyes through which the reader encounters the prison world. And what a world it is! Dostoevsky describes it with a precision that borders on the scientific. The daily routines, the hierarchy among the prisoners, the work details, the food, the punishments, the small freedoms that meant everything, and the large humiliations that had to be endured. But he also describes it with a novelist's eye for the individual, the particular, the irreducibly human. There is the prisoner who keeps a pet goat and talks to it like a child. There is the old man who has been flogged so many times that his back is a map of scars, a topography of suffering. There is the moment when the prisoners are allowed to perform a play, and the murderers and thieves transform themselves into actors, into artists, their faces lit with a joy that the narrator has never seen in them before. These are not types or symbols. They are people, rendered with the same care and complexity that Dostoevsky would later bring to Raskolnikov and Prince Mishkin and the brothers Karamazov. And running through it all is a question that would haunt his work for the rest of his life. What is the relationship between suffering and redemption? The prison is a place of almost unimaginable suffering, physical, psychological, spiritual. And yet it is also, in some strange way, a place where transformation becomes possible. Not for everyone, not easily, but the very extremity of the conditions strips away the pretenses and self-deceptions that people use to get through ordinary life. In prison, you see what you really are. And for some of the men Dostoevsky encountered, that terrible clarity was the beginning of something like salvation. The book was a success, both critical and popular. It reminded the literary world that Dostoevsky existed, that he had things to say, that the young man who had written Poor Folk had become something else entirely, harder, deeper, more unsettling. It also established themes that would recur throughout his later work: the psychology of the criminal mind, the question of free will, the terrible freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose, the possibility of grace in the darkest places. But even as his literary career began to revive, Dostoevsky's personal life was unravelling. His marriage to Maria Dmitrievna had been a mistake from the beginning, and both of them knew it. She was consumptive, irritable, unhappy. He was restless, prone to seizures, consumed by his work. They made each other miserable in the particular way that only two unhappy people bound together can. The love he had felt for her in Siberia, if it had ever really been love, and not just loneliness dressed up in romantic language, had curdled into something closer to duty and resentment. And then there was the matter of his brother Mikhail. Of all the relationships in Dostoevsky's life, this was perhaps the most important and the most complicated. Mikhail was older, steadier, more practical. He had not been arrested, had not been sent to Siberia. He had stayed behind and built a life, a modest one, but stable. And when Fyodor returned, the two brothers decided to go into business together. They would start a magazine. This was the era of the thick journal in Russia, a time when literary magazines were not just entertainment but battlegrounds for ideas, platforms for political and philosophical debate disguised as literary criticism. Everyone who mattered read the thick journals. Everyone who wanted to matter wrote for them, and the Dostoevsky brothers, with their magazine Time and later Epoch, intended to carve out a position that was neither radical nor reactionary, neither Western nor Slavophile, but something new, a synthesis that would speak to the particular conditions of Russian life. It was an ambitious project, and for a while it worked. The magazine attracted talented contributors, found readers, made money, or at least enough money to keep going. Dostoevsky threw himself into the work, writing criticism, editing submissions, arguing with printers and censors and distributors. It was exhausting, thankless labour, the kind of work that eats time without leaving much behind. But it kept him engaged with the literary world, kept his name in front of the public, gave him a platform for his ideas, and his ideas were evolving. The young Dostoevsky had been drawn to utopian socialism, to dreams of a rationally organised society where suffering would be eliminated and human beings would finally live as they were meant to live. The Siberia Dostoevsky had left those dreams behind. Not because he no longer cared about suffering, he cared more than ever, but because he had seen what human beings actually were, and he no longer believed that any social system, no matter how perfectly designed, could transform them into something they were not. The radicals of the 1860s, the nihilists, the materialists, the young people who talked of science and progress, and the inevitable march of history, filled him with a particular kind of horror. Not because they were wrong about the problems were real. Russia was backward, unjust, cruel in ways that cried out for change. But the solutions the radicals proposed, their confidence that they could remake society according to rational principles, their contempt for religion and tradition, and the messy, irrational depths of the human soul. This struck Dostoevsky as not just mistaken, but dangerous. These were people who had never been to Siberia. They had never seen what happens when the restraints of civilization are stripped away. They did not know what they were playing with. This tension between the genuine need for change and the terrible risks of the methods being proposed would become the central preoccupation of his political thinking. He was not a conservative in any simple sense. He was not defending the existing order because he thought it was good or just. He was warning that the attempt to destroy it might unleash forces that no one could control, that the cure might be worse than the disease, that in trying to build heaven on earth, the radicals might create a hell instead. But in the early 1860s these were still inchoate thoughts, arguments he was working out in magazine articles and letters and conversations. The great novels that would give them their fullest expression were still years away. For now he was a man struggling to stay afloat, working too hard, sleeping too little, fighting with his wife and worrying about money and having seizures that left him drained and disoriented for days afterward. The seizures had begun in Siberia, though their exact origin remains unclear. Some scholars believe he had epilepsy all along, and it simply manifested under the stress of prison life. Others think the beatings he received, or the shock of the mock execution, or some combination of factors triggered the condition. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. The seizures came without warning. They could strike him in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of the street, in the middle of the night. And they were often preceded by a strange, ecstatic feeling, a moment of perfect clarity and joy that he would later describe in some of his most famous passages. Prince Myshkin, in The Idiot, experiences this same aura before his seizures. He calls it a moment when everything becomes clear, when you understand the meaning of the phrase that time shall be no more. It lasts only a few seconds, and then comes the darkness, the convulsions, the long recovery. But those few seconds are worth years of ordinary life. That, at least, is how Dostoevsky felt about it. The seizures were destroying his body, shortening his life, making it impossible to plan or to work with any consistency. But they also gave him access to something, some glimpse of transcendence, some taste of what mystics describe, that he valued above almost anything else. This is another of the contradictions that define him. He was a man of intense religious feeling, drawn to Christ as a figure of infinite compassion and suffering. And yet his faith was never secure, never comfortable, never free from doubt. He famously said that if anyone could prove to him that Christ was outside the truth, and the truth was outside Christ, he would choose to stay with Christ rather than with the truth. It is a statement that has baffled and troubled readers ever since. What kind of faith chooses to believe what it knows might not be true? What kind of commitment is that? But perhaps it is the only kind of faith that is honest, the kind that admits its own uncertainty and chooses anyway, the kind that knows the darkness is real, that has seen it, lived in it, been nearly swallowed by it, and still chooses the light, not because it can prove the light is there, but because the alternative is unbearable. This is faith as a wager, faith as a leap, faith as an act of the will against all the evidence of a cold and indifferent universe. In 1863, the magazine Time was suddenly shut down by the government. The immediate cause was an article, not even written by Dostoevsky, that the censors deemed sympathetic to Polish rebels who had recently risen up against Russian rule. It was a disaster. The magazine had debts, it had contracts, it had employees who depended on their salaries, and now it was gone, wiped out by the arbitrary exercise of state power. Dostoevsky scrambled to salvage what he could. He started a new magazine, Epoch, which was essentially Time under a different name. But the disruption had been costly, and the new magazine never quite recovered the momentum of the old one. And then, in 1864, two blows fell in quick succession that would shake him to his foundations. First, Maria Dmitrievna died. Her death had been expected for years. She had been fading slowly, coughing blood, wasting away, and yet when it finally came, it struck Dostoevsky with unexpected force. Whatever their marriage had been, whatever failures of love and understanding lay between them, she had been his wife for 7 years. He had cared for her, worried about her, sat by her bedside through the long nights of her final illness. And now she was gone, and he was left with the peculiar guilt of the survivor, the person who gets to keep living while someone else stops. 3 months later, Mikhail died. His brother, his partner, the person who had handled the practical side of the magazine while Dostoevsky handled the creative side. The loss was both personal and professional, a grief that cut deep and a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Because Mikhail had left debts, substantial debts that Dostoevsky, as his brother's partner, now found himself obligated to repay. The magazine was failing, the creditors were circling, and Dostoevsky, already exhausted by the deaths and the work and the seizures, had to somehow find a way to keep going. This is when he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He took on his brother's debts. He didn't have to. There were legal ways to avoid them, but he took them on anyway, as a matter of honour, as a matter of duty to his brother's memory and his brother's family. It was, in one sense, an act of profound generosity. But it was also, in another sense, the beginning of a financial nightmare that would pursue him for years. He would spend the next decade in a constant state of financial crisis, always behind, always scrambling to pay the interest on loans that never seemed to shrink. He would write under deadline pressures that would have broken most writers. Entire novels dictated in weeks, chapters sent to the printer before the next chapters were finished, gambling away advances and then begging publishers for more. The great books that we read today as masterpieces of world literature were often produced under conditions of almost unbearable stress, with creditors threatening and rent unpaid, and the next seizure always lurking somewhere in the darkness ahead. But that is the strange alchemy of his life. The pressure, the suffering, the constant proximity to disaster, these were not obstacles to his art. They were, in some perverse way, its fuel. The man who had learned in Siberia that every moment was precious, that time was finite, that the reprieve might not come again, that man now lived under a different kind of sentence, a slow grinding pressure that forced him to write, to produce, to pour out everything he had while he still could. And what he poured out was extraordinary. In 1864, in the midst of his grief and his financial collapse, he wrote Notes from Underground. It is a short book, barely a novella, and at first glance it seems like a minor work, a diversion from the larger projects he would later undertake. But Notes from Underground is not minor. It is, in many ways, the key to everything that comes after. The seed from which the great novels would grow. The narrator of Notes from Underground is not a hero. He is not even an anti-hero in the romantic sense. He is something more disturbing than that. A man who is fully aware of his own pettiness, his own spite, his own capacity for self-destruction, and who refuses to change. He is what Dostoevsky calls a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. He lives in a corner of St. Petersburg, nursing his resentments, spinning elaborate intellectual justifications for his paralysis, lashing out at anyone who tries to help him. And yet, for all his pathology, the underground man has something important to say. He is the voice of rebellion against the rational, progressive, utilitarian worldview that was gaining ground in the 1860s. He is the man who says, "What if I do not want what is good for me? What if I want to suffer, just to prove that I am free? What if I refuse to be a piano key, pressed by the laws of nature and society into playing the note that has been determined for me? What then?" These are not comfortable questions. They do not lead to comfortable answers, but they are the questions that Dostoevsky would spend the rest of his life exploring, in ever deeper and more complex forms. The underground man is Raskolnikov before the murder. He is Ivan Karamazov before the Grand Inquisitor. He is the whisper of nihilism that Dostoevsky heard in the air of his time and felt he had to answer, not by ignoring it, but by following it all the way down to its foundations and seeing what, if anything, could be built there. The book was not a great success when it was published. It was too strange, too uncomfortable, too far ahead of its time, but it marked a turning point. The Dostoevsky who emerged from 1864, grieving, broke, exhausted, was also, somehow, more fully himself than he had ever been. The furnace had done its work. The man who had been cracked open in Siberia was now beginning to write from that crack, to let the darkness and the light pour through in equal measure. And the greatest of the dark and light was about to begin. Because it was in the summer of 1865, drowning in debt and desperate for money, that Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote to his publisher with a proposal. He would write them a new novel. It would be about a young man, a former student, who believes he is above ordinary morality. And it would be about what happens when that young man takes an axe and murders an old woman. He called the book Crime and Punishment, and with it he would change the landscape of literature forever. The idea came to him in fragments, the way the most important ideas often do, not as a complete vision, fully formed, but as a series of images and questions that would not leave him alone. A young man standing in a stairwell, an axe, an old woman counting coins, and beneath all of it, a question that had been growing in Dostoevsky's mind for years, a question he had heard in the radical circles of his youth, in the prison barracks of Siberia, in the nihilist manifestos that were beginning to circulate through the coffee houses and student apartments of St. Petersburg. The question was simple, and it was devastating. What if there is no God? What if the old morality is merely convention, superstition, a set of chains that the strong have every right to break? What if some men, the exceptional ones, the Napoleons, are entitled to step over the ordinary rules that bind ordinary people? What then? Dostoevsky had heard this logic. He understood it. In some part of himself, he had even felt its seductive pull. But he also knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic, that it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being factually incorrect. He could not prove that it was incorrect, any more than the nihilist could prove that it was right. Wrong in the sense of being spiritually catastrophic. A path that led, with perfect rationality, to the annihilation of everything that made human life bearable. And he knew that the only way to answer this logic was not to argue against it from the outside, but to embody it, to follow it into its darkest corners, to let a character live it out to its terrible conclusion and see what remained when the dust settled. That character was Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. The name itself was a kind of puzzle. In Russian, Raskol means a split, a schism, a division. Raskolnikov is a man divided against himself, between the theory he believes and the reality he cannot escape, between the conviction that he is extraordinary and the suspicion that he is merely ordinary, between the cold logic of his crime and the unbearable heat of his conscience. He is a student, or was a student, before poverty forced him to abandon his studies. He lives in a tiny garret room in St. Petersburg, barely larger than a coffin, and this room becomes one of the great settings in all of literature, a physical manifestation of the psychological prison Raskolnikov has built around himself. The novel begins in that room, in the sweltering heat of a St. Petersburg summer, with a young man lying on his bed thinking. What he is thinking about is murder. This is the audacity of the book, the thing that made it unlike anything that had come before. Dostoevsky does not begin with the crime and then reveal the criminal. He does not give us a detective story in which the murderer's identity is a mystery to be solved. Instead, he gives us the criminal from the first page, puts us inside his head, lets us follow the logic of his thinking as he convinces himself that what he's about to do is not only permissible but necessary. We are complicit from the beginning. We know what is coming, and we cannot look away. Raskolnikov's theory is elegant in its horror. He divides humanity into two categories, the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary are bound by law, by morality, by the rules that keep society functioning. They are the material of history, the masses who live and die without leaving a mark. The extraordinary, the Caesars, the Napoleons, the great men who reshape the world, are not bound by these rules. They have the right, perhaps even the duty, to transgress ordinary morality in service of their higher purposes. If Napoleon had to step over corpses to achieve his destiny, did that make him a criminal? Or did it make him a force of history beyond good and evil? Raskolnikov believes he is one of the extraordinary. He has told himself this story so many times that it has become a kind of religion. And now he has found a test, a way to prove to himself that he belongs among the great men. There is an old woman, a pawnbroker, who lives in a cramped apartment nearby. She is grasping, unpleasant, a louse, who contributes nothing to the world while hoarding her wealth. If Raskolnikov were to kill her, take her money, use it to complete his education, and launch himself into a career of service to humanity, would that not be a net good for the world? One worthless life ended, countless lives improved. The arithmetic is simple, the logic is clean. What the logic does not account for is everything else. The scene of the murder is one of the most harrowing passages in all of literature, and Dostoevsky achieves this not through graphic description but through accumulation of detail, the building pressure of a consciousness trapped in the moment of its own disintegration. Raskolnikov climbs the stairs to the old woman's apartment. He knocks, he waits, his heart pounds, the door opens, and then the axe comes down, and in that instant everything changes, not just for Raskolnikov, but for the reader, who has been carried along by the logic, who has perhaps even begun to entertain the theory, and who now finds themselves staring at the reality of what that theory produces. The old woman's skull split open, blood pooling on the floor, and then, the detail that destroys Raskolnikov's careful plan entirely, the sister, Lizaveta, who was not supposed to be home, who walks through the door at the worst possible moment, her mouth opening in a scream that never comes because the axe is already falling again. Lizaveta, who is innocent. Lizaveta, who is simple and kind, and has done nothing to deserve this. Lizaveta, who is the crack in the theory, the proof that the arithmetic of murder never adds up the way the murderer imagines. Raskolnikov escapes. He takes the old woman's purse and a few pawned items, buries them under a rock, and spends the rest of the novel in a state of barely controlled disintegration. The crime that was supposed to prove his extraordinary nature has instead revealed something he cannot face, that he is not extraordinary at all, that he is, in fact, ordinary, an ordinary man who has done an extraordinary evil, and who must now live with the knowledge of what he has done. This is the core of the novel's genius. Dostoevsky does not punish Raskolnikov through external means. The police investigation proceeds slowly. The detective Porfiry suspects but cannot prove, but through internal collapse. Raskolnikov's own conscience becomes his torturer. He cannot sleep, he cannot eat. He wanders the streets of St. Petersburg in a fever, watching the world continue around him as if nothing has happened, feeling the terrible isolation of the guilty. He is drawn, again and again, back to the scene of the crime, as if pulled by some force he cannot resist. He nearly confesses a dozen times, to strangers, to friends, to anyone who will listen, because the weight of the secret is unbearable, and he cannot find any way to put it down. And yet confession is also impossible, because confession means admitting that the theory was wrong, that he is not Napoleon, that he is merely a murderer. The novel is structured around a series of encounters, each of which strips away another layer of Raskolnikov's defences. There is the meeting with Marmeladov, the drunk whose daughter Sonia has been forced into prostitution to support her starving family. A man who has failed at everything, who knows he has failed, who pours out his shame to anyone who will listen and yet cannot stop drinking, cannot change, cannot do anything but stumble toward his own destruction. Raskolnikov is repelled by Marmeladov, and at the same time he recognizes something of himself in this wreck of a man. They are both trapped by forces they cannot control, spinning elaborate justifications for their powerlessness. There is the encounter with Sonia herself, the prostitute who has sacrificed her body to save her family and who has somehow, impossibly retained her faith, her purity, her belief in redemption. Sonia should be ruined. By every rational standard, she should be hardened, cynical, broken. Instead, she reads the Bible. She prays. She believes that God sees her suffering and will not abandon her. When Raskolnikov challenges this faith, when he points out the logical absurdity of believing in a God who would allow such suffering, Sonia cannot answer him with arguments. She can only tremble and weep and hold to her faith with both hands because it is the only thing that keeps her alive. Raskolnikov is drawn to Sonia precisely because she represents everything his theory denies. If his theory is correct, Sonia is a fool, clinging to illusions in a world that has no place for them. But if Sonia is right, if there is something in the human soul that cannot be explained by reason, something that persists despite suffering, something that reaches toward transcendence even from the depths of degradation, then Raskolnikov's entire worldview collapses, and he must face what he has done without the comfort of his philosophy. It is to Sonia that he eventually confesses, not to the police, not to Porfiry, but to this ruined girl who should hate him and instead weeps for him, who presses her cross into his hand and tells him to go to the crossroads, to bow down and kiss the earth he has defiled, to confess publicly and accept his punishment. And Raskolnikov does go. He does bow down. He does kiss the earth, in one of the most controversial and debated scenes in the novel, a moment that has divided readers for 150 years. Is it genuine conversion? Is it psychological collapse? Is it the first step toward redemption? Or merely a surrender born of exhaustion? Dostoevsky does not give us easy answers. The confession leads to prison, to Siberia, the same Siberia that Dostoevsky himself had endured. And it is only there, in the prison camp, that something begins to shift. Not through argument, not through theology, not through any rational process, but through a dream, a vision of the world consumed by a plague of nihilism, in which everyone believes themselves to be the sole possessor of truth and civilization tears itself apart. Raskolnikov wakes from this dream to find Sonia waiting for him outside the prison walls. She has followed him to Siberia. She has never abandoned him, and in that moment something breaks open in him at last. The novel ends not with resolution but with promise. Raskolnikov is still in prison. He still has years to serve. The full story of his regeneration, Dostoevsky tells us, might be the subject of a new story, but our present story is ended. It is a strange conclusion, almost an anti-conclusion, and yet it is exactly right. Because Dostoevsky understood that redemption is not a single moment of conversion, but a long and difficult process, a gradual turning that happens in the depths of the soul where no one else can see. The book does not show us Raskolnikov saved. It shows us the first glimmer of light in a darkness that has seemed absolute, and it asks us to believe that the light will grow. Crime and Punishment was published in instalments throughout 1866, appearing in the conservative journal The Russian Messenger, while Dostoevsky was still writing the later chapters. The response was immediate and enormous. Here was something new in Russian literature, something that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. The critics debated. The radicals were furious. They saw correctly that the novel was an attack on their philosophy, a dramatization of what happened when the logic of rational self-interest was followed to its ultimate conclusion. The conservatives were uncertain. The novel was on their side, in a sense, but it was so dark, so unflinching in its depiction of evil, that it felt almost as dangerous as what it criticized. And the readers, the ordinary readers, devoured it. Because Dostoevsky had done something that transcended political categories. He had written a novel that felt true. Not true in the sense of factual accuracy, but true in the way that certain works of art are true. They touch something deep in our experience of being human, something we recognize even if we have never committed murder, never lived in a garret room, never debated the philosophy of nihilism. We recognize Raskolnikov because we recognize the logic of self-justification, the way the mind can convince itself of anything when it wants something badly enough. We recognize the terror of conscience, the way guilt makes every ordinary moment into a confrontation with what we have done. We recognize the hunger for redemption, the longing to be clean, to be forgiven, to start again. And yet even as Crime and Punishment was appearing in the journals, even as it was establishing Dostoevsky as one of the major voices of Russian literature, the man himself was barely holding on. The debts were still there. The creditors were still circling. Stelovsky, the publisher who had purchased the rights to his collected works, was waiting for Dostoevsky to miss his deadline so he could seize everything, every future work, every kopeck of future income. The pressure was relentless, and it was about to produce something extraordinary. Not just one masterpiece, but two, written almost simultaneously in a feat of creative endurance that seems almost impossible when you consider the circumstances. Because while he was finishing Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky was also writing another novel entirely, a novel he had to complete in less than a month, or lose everything. The deadline was November 1st, 1866. Stelovsky's contract specified that Dostoevsky must deliver a new novel of a certain length by that date, or forfeit all rights to his work. It was September, and Dostoevsky had nothing, no draft, no outline, barely even a concept. He was still writing Raskolnikov's journey toward the prison camps while the clock ticked toward his own potential destruction. Friends urged him to hire a stenographer, someone who could take dictation and help him produce the necessary pages faster than he could write by hand. Dostoevsky was skeptical. He had never worked this way, had always written in longhand, revising obsessively as he went, but he had no choice. And so a young woman arrived at his apartment on October 4th, 1866, prepared to take down whatever he might dictate. Her name was Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. She was 20 years old. She was organized, efficient, practical in all the ways that Dostoevsky was not. She had read his work and admired it, but she was not starstruck. She was there to do a job, and she intended to do it well. What happened over the next 26 days was something close to a miracle. Dostoevsky dictated, Anna transcribed, and together they produced The Gambler, a novel born of desperation, written at a pace that should have produced garbage, and instead produced something vital and strange, a study of obsession and self-destruction that drew directly on Dostoevsky's own experiences at the roulette tables of Europe. The novel is not one of his greatest works, but it is honest in a way that only work produced under extreme pressure can be. There was no time for self-deception, no time for careful craft. Dostoevsky had to tell the truth about gambling, about the fever of it, the way it consumed everything else, the simultaneous knowledge that you were destroying yourself and the inability to stop. And he told that truth because he had no choice, because Anna was waiting for the next sentence and the deadline was waiting for them both. They finished on October 30th, one day before the deadline. Dostoevsky tried to deliver the manuscript to Stelovsky, only to find that the publisher had conveniently disappeared, hoping to deny receipt and claim the forfeit. But Dostoevsky was prepared. He left the manuscript with a police official, obtained a receipt with a timestamp, and the trap was sprung in reverse. Stelovsky was outmanoeuvred, the rights were saved, and something else had happened in those 26 days, something that neither Dostoevsky nor Anna had expected. They had fallen in love. It seems improbable, this romance born of business necessity, this union of a 45-year-old epileptic writer buried in debt and a 20-year-old stenographer who had come to do a job. But the circumstances that should have made intimacy impossible had instead made it inevitable. They had worked together day and night, hour after hour, in the intensity of shared crisis. Anna had seen Dostoevsky at his worst, frantic, desperate, doubting, and she had not flinched. Dostoevsky had seen Anna's competence, her steadiness, her refusal to be frightened by the chaos of his life. They had become, without quite realizing it, partners. On November 8th, 1 week after the deadline passed, Dostoevsky proposed. Anna accepted, and on February 15th, 1867, they were married. It would prove to be the most important decision of his life, and hers. The marriage began with flight. Within weeks of the wedding, Dostoevsky and Anna left Russia, driven out by the same forces that had plagued him for years: creditors, relatives demanding money, the suffocating weight of debts he could never seem to escape. They told themselves it would be temporary, a few months abroad to write in peace, to escape the constant knocking at the door, the letters threatening legal action, the relatives who treated Dostoevsky as a bank rather than a human being. A few months became 4 years. They travelled to Dresden first, then to Baden-Baden, then to Geneva, to Milan, to Florence, to Prague, moving from city to city across Europe like refugees from his own life. And almost immediately the pattern reasserted itself. Dostoevsky found the casinos. In Baden-Baden, in Saxon-les-Bains, in every city that had a roulette wheel, he found his way to the table. The fever had not died with the completion of The Gambler. If anything, writing about it had only sharpened the craving. He would take whatever money they had, whatever Anna had carefully budgeted for rent and food and postage, and he would lose it. All of it. Every time. He would return to their rented rooms having pawned his coat, having pawned Anna's earrings, having pawned her wedding ring, shaking and weeping and swearing that this was the last time, that he had finally understood that he would never gamble again. And Anna would listen, and hold him, and believe him. Or perhaps not believe him, but choose to act as if she did. And then a week or a month later it would happen again. It is difficult to overstate how destructive this was, or how remarkable Anna's response to it. She was 20 years old when they married, then 21, then 22, living in foreign countries where she did not speak the language, pregnant, then grieving, then pregnant again, watching the man she loved systematically destroy every chance at stability they had. She kept meticulous records, notebooks filled with accounts of every ruble, every franc, every desperate telegram to her mother begging for money to be wired. She tracked the gambling losses the way a doctor might track the progress of a disease methodically, without flinching, as if the act of writing it down could contain the damage. And she did not leave. She did not threaten to leave. She did not make ultimatums or deliver lectures. She simply stayed, managed what could be managed, and waited. Why? The question feels almost impertinent, and yet it demands asking. Anna was young, intelligent, capable. She had options that she chose not to exercise. The easy answer is that she loved him, and this is certainly true, but it is not the whole truth. Anna saw something in Dostoevsky that many people missed, something that his creditors and his critics and even his literary rivals failed to see. She saw that the gambling and the chaos and the self-destruction were not all of him, were perhaps not even the truest part of him. She saw the work. She understood, with a clarity that bordered on the prophetic, that the man who could write Crime and Punishment was someone worth saving, and that saving him was work that only she could do. And there was something else, something harder to name. Anna was not a passive sufferer. She was a strategist, a manager, a woman who liked to solve problems. The chaos of Dostoevsky's life was not just a burden to her. It was, in some strange way, a calling. She found purpose in bringing order to disorder, in standing steady while everything else fell apart. The marriage that should have broken her instead revealed capacities she had not known she possessed. She became not just his wife, but his collaborator, his business manager, his shield against the world. In doing so, she found her own form of fulfillment, one that was deeply enmeshed with his suffering, perhaps unhealthily so, but real nonetheless. The first years abroad were brutal. Their daughter Sonia was born in Geneva in February of 1868, a premature infant, fragile from the start. For 3 months they watched her struggle to survive, Dostoevsky writing rapturous letters about the beauty of fatherhood, Anna noting in her diary every feeding, every hour of sleep, every small sign of hope or worry. Then, in May, Sonia died. She was 3 months old. The death broke something in Dostoevsky that would never fully heal. He wrote to a friend that he had never imagined he could love anything so much, that the loss was unlike anything he had experienced, that even the years in prison had not prepared him for this. Anna buried her grief in practicality, arranging the funeral, managing the details, keeping the household running while Dostoevsky collapsed into mourning. But her notebooks from that period show the cost. The entries become sparse, the handwriting cramped, the careful accounting interrupted by blank pages where she could not bring herself to write. They kept moving, Bologna, Florence, Milan, always running from creditors, from memories, from the gambling debts that followed them like a shadow. Anna became pregnant again, and in September of 1869, their daughter Lubov was born in Dresden. Healthy this time, a survivor like her mother. And still Dostoevsky gambled, still he lost, still he returned to Anna with empty pockets and desperate apologies. The cycle seemed unbreakable, but something was changing in his work. The years of exile, of loss, of constant financial terror were producing writing of unprecedented depth. In the rented rooms of Geneva and Florence, working on borrowed time with borrowed money, Dostoevsky was writing The Idiot. He had conceived it as the story of a truly good man, a Christ-like figure attempting to live in a world that could not accommodate goodness, a world that would inevitably destroy what it could not comprehend. Prince Mishkin, the idiot of the title, is an epileptic like his creator, gentle and perceptive and utterly unable to protect himself or those he loves. He sees everything, understands everything, and can prevent nothing. The novel is Dostoevsky's most personal, his most painful, and in many ways his most flawed. He wrote it in fragments, sending chapters to his publisher before he knew how they would connect, changing direction midway, struggling to capture something that kept slipping away from him. The Idiot was not a success in the way Crime and Punishment had been. Critics found it confusing, structurally unwieldy, its meaning unclear. Sales were modest. But Dostoevsky knew he had touched something essential, something that his earlier work had only circled around. The question at the heart of The Idiot, whether genuine goodness can survive in the world, whether innocence is anything other than a death sentence, would haunt all of his remaining work. And the novel's central scene, in which Mishkin describes the experience of the moments before execution, draws so directly on Dostoevsky's own experience in the Semyonov Square that it reads less like fiction than like testimony finally given voice. There is a passage near the end of the first part of The Idiot that has troubled readers ever since it was written. Mishkin is describing a painting he once saw, Hans Holbein's Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb, which depicts the corpse of Jesus as merely and entirely dead, without any suggestion of coming resurrection, without glory or hope, just decaying flesh in a stone box. Mishkin says that looking at this painting could make a man lose his faith. The comment seems to come from nowhere in the narrative, and yet it resonates through everything that follows. Dostoevsky had seen the Holbein painting in Basel, had stood before it so long that Anna had to pull him away, and the image had lodged in him like a splinter. What does it mean to believe in resurrection when you have seen the body? What does it mean to hope when you have seen the corpse of hope itself? These were not abstract questions for Dostoevsky. They were the questions of his life, and The Idiot is his attempt to answer them. An attempt that fails, as perhaps it must fail, but fails magnificently. After The Idiot came The Eternal Husband, a shorter work, a strange psychological study of a cuckolded husband who becomes obsessed with his dead wife's lover. It is often overlooked in discussions of Dostoevsky's major works, but it contains some of his most precise writing, his most controlled exploration of the unconscious motivations that drive human behaviour. The narrator, Velchaninov, cannot understand why the wronged husband keeps seeking him out, cannot understand what the man wants from him, and this incomprehension becomes the engine of the entire novella. Dostoevsky was learning to write about what people do not know about themselves, about the gap between conscious intention and actual behaviour, about the way the human mind hides its own workings from itself. This was territory that would become familiar in the 20th century, that Freud would map and name, but Dostoevsky was there first, working in the dark, finding his way by feel. The breakthrough came in 1871, in the novel that would establish him definitively as a political writer, as a prophet of the violence that was coming. Demons, sometimes translated as the possessed, sometimes as the devils, was Dostoevsky's response to the radical movement that was sweeping through Russian youth, the nihilism that preached the destruction of all existing order as the necessary prelude to building something new. The novel was inspired by a real event, the murder of a student named Ivan Ivanov by his fellow revolutionaries, led by a man named Sergei Nechayev. Nechayev had written a manifesto called the Revolutionary Catechism, which argued that true revolutionaries must become instruments of destruction without conscience or connection, that they must be willing to kill anyone, including their own comrades, who threatened the cause. He had convinced a small circle of followers that Ivanov was a traitor, and they had beaten him to death and thrown his body into a pond. When the murder was discovered and Nechayev fled abroad, the trial became a sensation, and Dostoevsky saw in it the logical endpoint of everything he had warned against since his own radical youth. Demons is a novel of ideas, but it is also a novel of human destruction, and the destruction it depicts is not dated. The radicals in the book: Pyotr Verkovensky, modelled on Nechayev, Stavrogin, the empty charismatic centre around whom everyone else orbits; Shigalyov, the theorist who concludes that absolute freedom requires absolute despotism, are not period pieces. They are eternal types, the people who appear in every generation promising liberation and delivering only new forms of slavery. Dostoevsky hated them with a cold fury that still burns off the page, but he also understood them, understood that they were not monsters but human beings who had made terrible choices, understood that the ideas that drove them were not alien impositions but corruptions of genuine longings for justice and change. The revolutionaries in Demons are wrong, catastrophically wrong, but they are not inexplicable. They are what happens when the desire to remake the world is untethered from any recognition of the world's actual complexity, from any humility about human nature, from any acknowledgement that the destruction of the old order does not automatically produce something better. The novel was politically explosive. Liberals denounced it as reactionary, a slander against the progressive movement, a betrayal of everything Dostoevsky had once believed. Conservatives praised it, but often for the wrong reasons, seeing in it a simple condemnation rather than the anguished examination that it actually was. And the radicals themselves, at least those who read it, recognized its accuracy with a kind of horror. Dostoevsky had gotten inside their heads, had understood their logic, had traced their thoughts to their most terrible conclusions, and he had done it all without ever simplifying, without ever turning them into caricatures. Even his villains think. While writing Demons, Dostoevsky was also fighting his oldest enemy. The gambling continued, reaching its crisis point in Wiesbaden in April of 1871. He had lost everything again, pawned everything again, written the usual desperate letters to Anna begging for money to be wired, promising that this time would be different. And then something happened that he would describe in his letters as a spiritual experience, something that finally broke the pattern that had held him for nearly a decade. He dreamed of his father, dead now for more than 30 years, murdered in the fields by his own serfs, and woke knowing that he would never gamble again. He wrote to Anna that a great thing had happened to him, that the fantasy that had tormented him for 10 years had vanished, that he felt reborn. And this time, remarkably, it was true. Dostoevsky never gambled again. The fever that had burned through thousands of rubles, that had brought him to the edge of destitution time after time, that had made a chaos of his marriage and his life, it ended. Not gradually, not through a process of tapering off, but all at once, as if a switch had been thrown. The man who'd been incapable of walking past a casino without entering, who had been possessed by the certainty that the next spin of the wheel would change everything, simply stopped. He was 50 years old. The psychological explanation is unclear. The dream of his father suggests some connection to unresolved guilt, some expiation that occurred in sleep, but this explains nothing. What changed was not his circumstances, which remained difficult, nor his personality, which remained the same strange mixture of intensity and weakness. What changed was simply the gambling itself, as if the compulsion had been a separate entity that had finally departed. Anna, characteristically, did not ask too many questions. She noted the change in her diary with something like disbelief, waited for the relapse that did not come, and gradually allowed herself to hope. In July of 1871, the Dostoevskys returned to Russia. They had been gone for 4 years. Anna was carrying their third child, a son, Fyodor, who would be born that summer. The debts remained, vast and seemingly permanent, but Anna had a plan. She had observed how Dostoevsky's works were published, how the rights were sold and the profits distributed, and she had concluded that they were being cheated, consistently and systematically, by publishers who knew how to exploit a desperate author. From this point forward, she would handle everything. She would become Dostoevsky's publisher, selling his books directly, bypassing the middlemen who had taken so much of what should have been theirs. It was an audacious plan for a woman in 19th century Russia, and it worked. Over the next decade, Anna would transform their financial situation, would turn the chaos into something approaching prosperity, would give Dostoevsky the stability he needed to write his greatest work. And the greatest was still to come. The Brothers Karamazov was years away, still germinating in the darkness, waiting for everything that would come before it. But the pieces were falling into place. The gambling was over. The wandering was over. Anna had taken control. Dostoevsky was home, and he was ready to write about God. The Russia they returned to had changed. 4 years is not a long time in the life of a nation, but the Russia of 1871 felt different from the Russia they had fled. More restless, more divided, more uncertain of itself. The reforms that had begun under Alexander II were generating their own contradictions. The freed serfs had not become prosperous farmers. They had become something more troubling, a vast rural population adrift between the old world and one that had not yet arrived. The universities were full of young people asking questions that had no safe answers. The censors were busier than ever, which meant that more people were writing things worth censoring. Dostoevsky noticed all of this. He had spent 4 years watching Russia from the outside, reading about it in newspapers and letters, imagining it from hotel rooms in Dresden and Baden-Baden. Now he was back in Petersburg, walking the same streets he had walked before prison, before exile, before the long, strange journey that had made him who he was. The city looked the same, the canals, the bridges, the white nights of summer, but he was not the same, and neither was anything else. They settled into an apartment. Anna set up her publishing operation, which initially consisted of a table, a stack of books, and her own indomitable will. She handled the correspondence, the shipping, the accounts, all while caring for 2 small children and pregnant with the third. Dostoevsky watched her work with something approaching awe. He had spent his life surrounded by impractical people, himself most of all, and here was someone who actually knew how to do things, who could translate dreams into reality, who could make the numbers add up. It was not romantic exactly. It was something better. It was partnership. The third child, Fyodor, was born in July, a son, finally, bearing his father's name. Dostoevsky was overcome with a complicated joy. He had wanted this, had hoped for it, and now it was here. Another life dependent on him, another mouth to feed, another reason to write faster. He was 50 years old and starting over, and somehow this felt right. The wandering years had been necessary, perhaps, but they were over now. This was where the work would happen, and the work was already calling to him. The idea that would become the Brothers Karamazov was still formless, still years away from taking shape, but other projects pressed more urgently. He needed to write something quickly, something that would sell, something that would begin to justify Anna's faith in her publishing scheme, and he needed to understand the country he had come back to, the strange ferment happening all around him. the arguments about Russia's future that were growing more heated with each passing month. What emerged from this period was not a novel at all. It was something unprecedented in Dostoevsky's career, a one-man journal called A Writer's Diary, which he would publish intermittently throughout the 1870s. In it, he addressed everything: current events, political philosophy, literary criticism, childhood memories, court cases, dreams, the destiny of the Russian people. It was rambling and brilliant, infuriating and prophetic, and it made him, for the first time in his life, genuinely famous. Not just known among the literary elite, not just respected by critics, but actually famous, recognised on the street, written to by strangers, consulted as an authority on matters spiritual and political. The diary revealed something about Dostoevsky that his novels had only hinted at: a mind that could not stop working, that saw connections everywhere, that was compelled to comment on everything. He wrote about suicide and spiritualism, about the Russian peasant and the European liberal, about the Eastern question and the meaning of suffering. He answered letters from readers, sometimes incorporating their questions directly into his entries. He was, in a sense, inventing a new form, something between the essay and the blog, though of course those words did not exist yet. He was thinking in public, and the public was listening. Some of what he wrote was wise, some of it was wrong. His nationalism grew more pronounced during these years, his belief in Russia's unique spiritual mission more fervent. He wrote dismissively of the West, of parliamentary democracy, of the Enlightenment values that he saw as corrosive to the Russian soul. He wrote about the Jews in ways that remain troubling today, ways that reflected the common prejudices of his time and something more personal, a resentment that seems connected to his money troubles and his dealings with certain creditors. The same mind that could create the most compassionate portraits of human weakness could also be startlingly uncharitable when it came to certain groups. This is not an excuse, it is a fact, and it complicates any attempt to make Dostoevsky into a saint. But the diary also contains some of his most profound thinking. He wrote about children with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, about the innocence that is destroyed by a world of cruelty, about the special horror of suffering that falls on those too young to understand or deserve it. This theme would become central to the Brothers Karamazov, the question of innocent suffering, of whether any divine plan could justify the tears of a single child. He was working it out in public, testing ideas, circling around the great novel that was still assembling itself in the back of his mind. And then there was the trial. In 1876, a young woman named Vera Zasulich walked into the office of the St. Petersburg police commander and shot him. He survived, but barely. She was arrested, tried, and, in a verdict that shocked the government, acquitted by a jury who saw her act not as terrorism, but as resistance to tyranny. The commander she had shot was known for his brutality toward political prisoners, and the jury, composed of ordinary Russians, had decided that some brutality deserved to be answered. Dostoevsky wrote about the case extensively in the diary, and his response was complicated. He did not celebrate the violence, he had seen enough of where that led, but he understood it, understood the desperation and idealism that had driven Zasulich to pull the trigger. He had known people like her, had been imprisoned with them, had watched them struggle between their love of humanity and their willingness to kill for it. The acquittal disturbed him, not because he wanted her punished, but because it suggested something about the mood of the country, about the breakdown of the faith in law and order that he believed was essential to civilization. Russia was moving towards something. He could feel it, and what it was moving toward frightened him. Meanwhile, Anna was quietly building an empire. The direct sales of Dostoevsky's books had been successful enough that she expanded the operation, adding more titles, handling distribution across Russia. She negotiated with printers and shipping companies, kept meticulous records, chased down debts. The mountain of obligations they had brought back from Europe began, slowly, to shrink. For the first time in his adult life, Dostoevsky was not being crushed by creditors. He was not rich, he would never be rich, but he was solvent, and that was a kind of miracle. The children were growing. Lyubov, the eldest, was proving to be a difficult child, temperamental, demanding, prone to tantrums that reminded Dostoevsky uncomfortably of himself. Little Fyodor was healthier, calmer, easier. Anna managed them all with the same efficiency she brought to the publishing business, though sometimes Dostoevsky caught something in her face, a tiredness that she tried to hide, a loneliness that came from giving everything to everyone else and having little left for herself. In the summer of 1875, Dostoevsky began work on what he called a novel about the Russian family, a massive conception that would take years to complete. This was The Brothers Karamazov, though it did not yet have that title. He knew only that it would be his longest work, his most ambitious, his final statement on everything that mattered. He was 54 years old, and he was not well. The emphysema that would kill him was already present, though not yet diagnosed. He tired easily, coughed often, felt the weight of his body in ways he had not felt before. Time was becoming precious. The novel began to take shape slowly. He filled notebooks with fragments, scenes, dialogues, character sketches, theological arguments. The Karamazov brothers emerged. Dmitri, the sensual, passionate eldest son, Ivan, the intellectual, tormented by the problem of God, Alyosha, the youngest, pure of heart, the one Dostoevsky loved best, and the father, old Fyodor Karamazov, a buffoon, a lecher, a fool, yet somehow pitiable, somehow human despite everything. The murder that would drive the plot was there from the beginning. The question of who killed the father, but this was never what the novel was really about. What it was really about was the question Dostoevsky had been asking all his life. Can God exist in a world where children suffer? The question had haunted him since the death of his first wife's son, since the death of his own children, since the years in prison when he had watched men broken by cruelty, since the moments before the firing squad when he had believed he was about to die. It had taken different forms at different times. Sometimes it was a question about justice, sometimes about meaning, sometimes about whether love was possible in a universe without God. But it always came back to the same core, the suffering of the innocent. If that suffering is meaningless, then everything is meaningless. And if everything is meaningless, then everything is permitted. This last phrase, everything is permitted, would become the most famous line in the novel, though Dostoevsky himself never writes it exactly that way. It emerges from the logic of Ivan Karamazov, the intellectual brother, who constructs an airtight case against the existence of a benevolent God. Ivan does not deny God's existence out of shallow atheism. He denies it out of moral outrage. He has collected examples of cruelty to children, drawn from actual court cases that Dostoevsky had written about in the diary, and he presents them to Alyosha as evidence. A little girl beaten by her parents, forced to eat her own excrement, locked in a freezing outhouse overnight. A serf boy torn to pieces by hunting dogs while his mother watches. These are not abstractions. These are things that happened, things that Dostoevsky had read about in newspapers and never forgotten. Ivan's argument is not that God does not exist. His argument is that even if God exists, even if there is some ultimate harmony that explains everything, he refuses to accept it. The price is too high. No future paradise can justify the torture of a single child. And therefore, and this is the terrible logic, if there is no cosmic justice, if the suffering is truly meaningless, then there is no basis for morality, no reason not to do anything at all. Everything is permitted. This is the abyss that Dostoevsky stared into all his life, and in The Brothers Karamazov he would finally face it directly. But he would not face it with philosophy. He would face it with story, with character, with the lived experience of people trying to find their way in a world that seems to offer no guidance. Ivan makes his argument, and it is devastating. But then Dostoevsky gives us Alyosha and the elder Zosima, and a different kind of response. Not an answer to Ivan's logic, but a way of living that does not require an answer. Love the particular, Zosima says. Love the earth. Love the leaves. Love the animals. Love every blade of grass. Active love. Not the idea of love, not love of humanity in the abstract, but love of this person, this moment, this suffering creature in front of you. This is not an argument. You cannot refute Ivan with it. But Dostoevsky understood that arguments are not how human beings actually decide how to live. We decide by example, by feeling, by seeing something beautiful in another person's life, and wanting to be like them. And so he gives us the example of Zosima, and then the example of Alyosha going out into the world, and finally the example of the children at the end of the novel, gathered around a stone that marks the grave of a boy they loved, promising to remember, promising to be good, promising that the memory of one innocent life can be enough to anchor a whole future. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1875, none of this was written yet. It was all still forming, still fermenting in Dostoevsky's notebooks and his mind. The diary continued to absorb much of his energy. The debts continued to shrink thanks to Anna. The children continued to grow, and Russia continued to move toward whatever it was moving toward, that gathering storm that Dostoevsky could feel without being able to name. He travelled that summer to a monastery called Optina Pustin, one of the most famous spiritual centres in Russia. He went not as a tourist, but as a seeker, hoping to find something he could use for his novel, hoping perhaps to find something he could use for himself. The monks there practiced a form of spiritual direction that was unusual even by orthodox standards. They had elders, starets, who were believed to possess special gifts of insight, who could see into the souls of those who came to them. Dostoevsky spoke with one of these elders, a man named Amvrosy, and their conversation lasted several hours. What passed between them he never fully recorded, but the character of Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov bears the marks of this encounter. The gentleness, the unexpected humour, the ability to understand without judging. The monastery visit was part of a broader turn in Dostoevsky's thinking during these years. He had always believed in God, in some sense, even during his periods of deepest doubt. But his belief had been complicated, shot through with questions and contradictions. Now, in his 50s, something was settling. Not that the questions disappeared, they never would, but that he had found a way to live with them, a way of believing that did not require the questions to be answered. Faith, he was coming to understand, was not a matter of certainty. It was a matter of commitment, of choosing to live as if something were true even in the face of evidence that suggested otherwise. This was what he would give Alyosha. This was what he hoped to show his readers. But first there was another novel to complete. A Raw Youth, published in 1875, is the least known of Dostoevsky's major works, and in some ways the least successful. It tells the story of an illegitimate young man trying to find his place in the world, and it contains flashes of the old brilliance, scenes of psychological intensity, moments of searing insight, but it lacks the unity of the earlier novels. Dostoevsky himself was not satisfied with it, though he defended it publicly. He was already thinking beyond it, already consumed by the larger work that was still taking shape. The mid-70s were a strange period of consolidation for Dostoevsky, a time when old battles were finally being won just as new ones were appearing on the horizon. The gambling was gone, truly gone, and with it the chaos that had defined so many years. The debts were being managed. The children were alive and reasonably healthy. Anna had created a life that actually worked, a domestic structure that could support the weight of Dostoevsky's genius without collapsing. And yet there was always the feeling that time was running out. The cough that came more often now, the fatigue that arrived earlier in the day, the knowledge, which Dostoevsky did not speak of but could not ignore, that he was not young anymore and would not live forever. He had so much still to write. The novel about the Russian family was there, waiting, demanding to be born, and beyond that he had plans for a sequel, a second volume that would follow Alyosha into the world, that would show what happened when innocence encountered the full force of human evil and had to find a way to survive. He would never write that sequel. He would barely finish the first volume, but he did not know that yet. What he knew was that the work had to be done, and done well, and done before whatever was coming came. So he wrote. Through the winters of Petersburg, through the summers when the family retreated to the country, through the illnesses and the interruptions and the endless demands of the diary, he wrote, the brothers Karamazov took shape slowly, painfully, with none of the frenzied speed that had produced his earlier novels. This time he revised, reconsidered, threw away pages and started again. This time he wanted to get it right. The brothers Karamazov began appearing in serialized form in January of 1879 in the pages of the Russian Messenger, and from the very first installments, Dostoevsky knew that he was writing something different from anything that had come before. The responses from readers confirmed it. Letters arrived in floods, sometimes dozens in a single week, from students and professors, from priests and atheists, from provincial merchants and aristocratic women who had never written to an author before. They did not speak of the novel in the usual terms of praise or criticism. They spoke as if they had been visited, as if something had entered their rooms and refused to leave. The novel opens with a family that is already broken, already scattered, already poisoned by decades of neglect and resentment. Old Fyodor Karamazov is a landowner of the worst type. Buffoonish, crude, interested only in pleasure, having abandoned both his wives and all three of his legitimate sons. The sons have grown up without him, raised by servants and distant relatives, shaped by his absence as surely as other children are shaped by a father's presence. When the novel begins, they are gathering for the first time, and the gathering will end in murder. But this is not in any simple sense a murder mystery. The murder, when it comes, is almost incidental to what Dostoevsky is actually writing about. He's writing about what it means to be a son of such a father. He's writing about what happens when the threads that hold a family together are cut, one by one, until nothing is left but suspicion and need. He's writing about Russia, about what Russia was becoming, about the forces that were tearing at its fabric from within. And he's writing about God, about whether God exists, about what it means to live in a world where he might not, about whether human beings can be good without him, or whether goodness requires something larger than the human to anchor itself to. Each of the three brothers carries a piece of this question. Dmitri, the eldest, is all passion and impulse, a man who feels everything too deeply and thinks about it too late. He is in love with a woman named Grushenka, desperately, destructively in love, and his love puts him in direct competition with his own father, who desires the same woman. Their rivalry over Grushenka is absurd and ugly and entirely believable. The kind of thing that actually happens in families where no one has ever learned to restrain themselves, where need is always expressed and never managed. Dmitri threatens his father publicly, speaks of killing him, waves his fists and shouts in the village square. When the old man is actually murdered, Dmitri is the obvious suspect. Everything points to him, the evidence is overwhelming, and yet, Ivan, the middle brother, is something else entirely. He is an intellectual, a man of ideas, and his ideas are terrifying. He does not believe in God, or rather, he accepts that God might exist but rejects his world as morally unacceptable. The suffering of innocent children, Ivan argues, is a price too high to pay for any cosmic harmony, any eternal paradise. If entrance to heaven requires stepping over the tears of even one tortured child, then Ivan would rather return his ticket. This is the argument that Dostoevsky gives to his greatest villain, not to a monster, but to a thoughtful, sensitive, morally serious man who has looked at the world clearly and found it wanting. The chapter in which Ivan makes this argument, which Dostoevsky titled Rebellion, is among the most disturbing he ever wrote. Ivan does not simply state his case, he provides evidence. He tells stories of children who have been tortured, beaten, killed by those who should have protected them. These stories are not invented. Dostoevsky drew them from newspaper accounts, from court records, from the actual annals of Russian cruelty. A general who sets his dogs on a peasant boy because the boy accidentally injured one of the general's hounds. A child of 5 beaten by her educated parents, shut in a freezing outhouse overnight, her mouth smeared with excrement as punishment for wetting her bed. These things happened. Dostoevsky did not need to embellish. The reality was terrible enough. And even asks, with a logic that is impossible to refute, if God exists, and if God permits this, then what kind of God is he? And if there is some ultimate explanation, some divine plan that makes sense of these horrors, is it an explanation that any decent person would want? Ivan would rather be wrong, would rather stand in eternal rebellion against a God who could permit such things, than accept a harmony built on the suffering of innocence. This is the challenge that Dostoevsky set for himself. He had created, in Ivan Karamazov, the most powerful case against God that he could imagine. He had given the atheist position everything: intellectual rigour, moral passion, the weight of evidence, and then he had to answer it. He had to find something that could stand against this argument, not by refuting it logically, because he knew it could not be logically refuted, but by offering something else, something that operated on a different level entirely. His answer was Alyosha. His answer was Father Zosima. His answer was not an argument at all, but a way of being in the world. Alyosha, the youngest brother, is the novel's spiritual centre, though he spends much of the narrative on the periphery of the action. He is a novice in the monastery, a student of Father Zosima, a young man who has chosen the religious life not out of weakness or escape, but out of something that looks very much like love. He loves people. He loves them without needing to understand them, without needing them to be worthy of love. When he looks at his drunken, lecherous father, he sees something worth saving. When he looks at his proud, atheistic brother, he sees someone in pain. This does not make him naive. He knows what people are. He simply does not believe that what they are is all they could be. Father Zosima, the elder who guides Alyosha, provides the novel's counter-argument to Ivan, though it is not delivered as an argument. It is delivered as a story, as a series of memories, as a deathbed confession that spreads across several chapters. Zosima was not always a holy man. In his youth, he was vain, violent, status-conscious, a typical young officer of his class. He challenged a man to a duel over a woman, intending to kill him. On the morning of the duel, something changed. He struck his servant in a fit of temper, then looked at what he had done and felt something break open inside him. He went to the duel, allowed his opponent to fire, then dropped his own pistol and begged forgiveness for having challenged him in the first place. The other officers thought he was mad. Perhaps he was. But from that moment something was different. He had glimpsed another way to live. Zosima's teaching, which Dostoevsky distributes throughout the novel, is not systematic theology. It is closer to what a wise grandfather might say to a beloved child, half memory and half blessing. Everyone is responsible to everyone for everything. Hell is the suffering of being unable to love. Do not be afraid of anything. The only thing to fear is despair. These are not answers to Ivan's challenge. They do not explain why children suffer or why God permits evil. They operate on a different plane, addressing not the intellect but something deeper, something in the chest rather than the head. Dostoevsky did not believe that Ivan's logic could be defeated by better logic. He believed it could only be answered by a different kind of evidence, the evidence of lives lived in love, of forgiveness given when it was not deserved, of beauty that appeared precisely where despair had seemed most complete. This was his wager. This was what he was betting on in the final novel. But Dostoevsky understood that such evidence is fragile, that it can look like weakness or delusion to those not prepared to see it. So he included, immediately after Zosima's death, one of the most remarkable scenes in all his fiction. Zosima dies, and his body begins to decay. This is perfectly natural, perfectly ordinary. All bodies decay. But the monks and pilgrims who have gathered expect a miracle. They expect the body of a saint to remain incorrupt, to give off the odour of sanctity rather than the stench of decomposition. When the opposite happens, when Zosima's corpse smells like any other corpse, there is scandal, disappointment, a sense that perhaps the elder was not so holy after all. Alyosha is devastated. His faith, which had seemed so secure, wavers. He leaves the monastery, wanders into the town, finds himself at the home of Grushenka, the woman over whom his father and brother are fighting. He expects to be corrupted there, to be pulled down into sin. Instead, something else happens. Grushenka, learning that Zosima has died, shows him unexpected kindness. She sits on his knee not to seduce him, but to comfort him, and in that moment, both of them are changed. He returns to the monastery that night, kneels before Zosima's coffin, and falls into a kind of vision, a dream of the marriage at Cana, of Christ turning water into wine, of joy, inexplicable joy, rising up from the bottom of his sorrow. He wakes and goes outside and falls upon the earth, weeping, kissing the ground, feeling something vast and interconnected pour through him. He will never be able to explain it. He will never try. But when he rises, he is different. His faith is not the same as it was before, not the easy faith of a boy who has never been tested. It is a faith that has passed through doubt, through disgust, through the smell of death, and has emerged on the other side. This is what Dostoevsky offers against Ivan's rebellion. Not proof, not explanation. An experience of something that makes the questions for a moment fall silent. The murder itself, when it comes, is almost anticlimactic. Old Fyodor is killed with a brass pestle, his skull broken, his money stolen. Dmitri is arrested, tried, convicted on circumstantial evidence that no reader believes is accurate. The true murderer, the novel gradually reveals, is Smerdyakov, the illegitimate fourth brother, the servant and cook, the epileptic whom no one notices, whom no one takes seriously. And Smerdyakov is killed not out of passion, as Dmitri was accused of doing, but out of philosophy. He has taken Ivan's arguments seriously. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. If nothing is eternal, then nothing matters. Why not kill the old man and take his money? Why not do whatever one wishes if there are no ultimate consequences? This is the burden that Ivan must carry for the rest of his life. His ideas, which he thought were merely intellectual, have borne fruit in the real world. Smerdyakov is his disciple, his creation. When Smerdyakov confesses to him, explaining calmly how Ivan's philosophy gave him permission, Ivan begins to go mad. He hallucinates a devil, a gentleman devil, shabby and ironic, who torments him with the suspicion that he, Ivan, wanted his father dead, that some part of him gave Smerdyakov silent permission, that the clean hands he thought he had are stained after all. The trial of Dmitri Karamazov occupies the final sections of the novel, and it is a performance of almost unbearable tension. The wrong man is being convicted. Everyone who has read the novel knows this. Dmitri himself knows he did not commit the murder, though he cannot prove it, though even he has moments of wondering whether he might have done it in some blackout of rage. The evidence against him is overwhelming. The witnesses are sincere. The prosecutor is brilliant, weaving a narrative that explains everything, that makes perfect sense, that is completely wrong. This is Dostoevsky's point. Human justice is not divine justice. We get things wrong. We send innocent men to Siberia and let guilty men walk free, and there is no guarantee in this world that the truth will out. Dmitri is convicted. He will be sent to hard labour, just as Dostoevsky was sent decades earlier, but something has changed in him during the trial. He has come to understand that even though he did not kill his father, he might have. He had the capacity. He had the hatred. He is guilty of everything except the specific act for which he is being punished. And this understanding paradoxically sets him free. He accepts his sentence not as injustice, but as a kind of purgation, a way of paying for all the violence and chaos and cruelty of his life, even the cruelty he only imagined. I accept my suffering, he says, not because I am guilty of this thing, but because I was capable of it. And I will go to Siberia, and perhaps in 20 years, when I return, I will be a different man. This is redemption, as Dostoevsky understood it. Not a magic erasure of sin, not a return to innocence. A long, slow, painful transformation, achieved through suffering, through acceptance, through the decision to stop running from what one has been. It was the redemption Dostoevsky had found in Omsk. It was the redemption he believed was available to anyone, to Russia itself, if only it could find the humility to accept it. The novel ends not with Dmitri's conviction, not with Ivan's madness, but with a funeral. A boy named Ilyusha, the son of a poor captain whom Dmitri had humiliated earlier in the story, has died of consumption. Alyosha has befriended Ilyusha and the group of schoolboys who gathered around him in his final months. Now, at the graveside, Alyosha speaks to them, speaks about memory, about love, about how the good things we do in childhood stay with us forever, how a single beautiful memory from early years might be enough to save a person later, when everything else has gone dark. Certainly we shall all rise again, Alyosha tells the boys. Certainly we shall see each other, and shall tell each other with joy and gladness all that has happened. One of the boys asks if this is really true. Alyosha says yes, and the boys, touched by something they cannot name, cry out together, "Hurrah for Karamazov!" It is a strange ending for a novel about murder and madness and the silence of God. It is also the only ending that could have worked. After everything, after Ivan's rebellion, after Zosima's decay, after the wrong man's conviction, Dostoevsky returns to the simplest possible thing. Children gathered at a grave, a promise of resurrection, a shared cry of hope. This is what he has to offer against the darkness. It is not enough to satisfy the intellect. It was never meant to be. It is meant to touch something else, something that reason cannot reach, something that might be called the soul. The Brothers Karamazov was completed in November of 1880. The final instalment appearing in the pages of the Russian Messenger just weeks before the new year. Dostoevsky was exhausted, triumphant, already planning the sequel that would follow Alyosha into the world. He had been imagining it for years. The great sinner, the fall and redemption, the testing of faith against every possible assault. This first novel was only the beginning. He would not live to write a single page of it. On January 28th, 1881, Dostoevsky suffered a severe hemorrhage in his lungs. The blood came suddenly without warning. while he was searching for a pen that had rolled behind a bookcase. He tried to move the furniture himself, refused to let Anna help, insisted on doing this small domestic task, and something inside him broke. The blood came in gouts, soaking his shirt, spattering the papers on his desk. He knew what it meant. He had always known this would come. Anna sent for the doctor, but there was little to be done. The hemorrhages continued through the night, through the next day, each one weaker than the last, each one taking more of him with it. Dostoevsky drifted in and out of consciousness. He asked for his children to be brought to his bedside. He blessed them. He asked Anna to open the Bible at random and read whatever verse appeared, an old fortune-telling custom from his childhood, one he had used at crucial moments throughout his life. The book fell open to Matthew chapter 3. "Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfil all righteousness." John the Baptist speaking to Jesus at the moment of baptism. Let it be. Let it happen as it must. Dostoevsky heard the words and seemed to understand. "You hear?" he told Anna. "Do not hold me back." He died on the evening of January 28th, 1881. He was 59 years old. In his pocket they found a crumpled letter from a reader who had written to tell him that the brothers Karamazov had saved her life. His funeral was unlike anything Russia had seen. 30,000 people followed the coffin through the streets of St. Petersburg, from the apartment on Kuznechny Lane to the Alexander Nevsky Monastery where he would be buried. The procession stretched for nearly a mile. Workers walked beside aristocrats. Students carried banners with lines from his novels. 72 delegations laid wreaths at the grave. The police who had watched Dostoevsky suspiciously for most of his adult life were present too, keeping order, protecting the body of a man they had once surveilled as a dangerous revolutionary. People wept openly. They had lost someone they felt they knew, someone who had seen into them with terrible clarity and had not looked away. For decades, he had been telling Russians the truth about themselves, the good and the evil, the capacity for sainthood and the capacity for murder, the faith that refuses to die even when every reason for faith has been destroyed. He had shown them the worst, and somehow, in showing it, he had made it possible to believe in the best. The questions he raised have not been answered. They cannot be answered. Is there a God? Can human beings be good without him? What do we owe each other? Why do innocent children suffer? These are not the kind of questions that admit of solutions. They are the kind of questions that define a life, that must be asked again and again in each generation by each person who has the courage to take them seriously. What Dostoevsky offered was not an answer, but a way of living with the questions. He showed that it was possible to believe without being certain, to hope without being naive, to face the darkness squarely and still find reasons to go on. His faith was not the faith of someone who had never doubted. It was the faith of someone who had doubted everything, who had descended into the abyss and found, at the very bottom, something that refused to die. This is what remains. Not the epilepsy or the gambling, not the debts or the depressions, not the quarrels with critics or the political contradictions. What remains is the work, and the work continues to reach across the years, finding readers who need it, who recognize themselves in it, who feel, reading him, that someone has finally spoken the truth that no one else would speak. And somewhere tonight, in a room not so different from yours, someone is opening the Brothers Karamazov for the first time. They do not yet know what they will find there. They do not know about Ivan's rebellion, or Alyosha's vision, about the wrong man convicted or the children at the graveside. They only know that they are about to begin something, that a voice is about to speak to them across a century and a half, that a man who lived through prison and poverty and loss, who gambled away his advances and watched his children die, who struggled with God every day of his life and never won a final victory, that this man has something to tell them. The book falls open. The first line appears, and Dostoevsky, in his way, begins again.